So last week we had some questions that we've been discussing here amongst all of us that a lot of people are probably may confused about or may not have the answer to. And I don't know if we have the answer to it, but the question is that once the buyer and seller get into escrow, they have a fully executed agreement. And now not the buyer changing their mind, but if the seller changes their mind and chooses to try to cancel the transaction, what ways can the seller get out of the transaction without too much difficulty? So what are the options, Darlene?
The seller's option to get out of the contract is if the buyer defaults.
Or if the seller has a contingency.
Correct.
Like a contingency to find a replacement property. So that is a contingency, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then the other option, Melissa, is if the buyer maybe asks for some sort of inspections and the seller says, no, I'm not doing any of the inspections.
Yeah, so the seller makes the buyer's life more difficult, or what Narlene said, doesn't perform on their release of contingencies, then the seller can do a notice to buyer to perform, and if they can't perform, then after the 3 days, then the seller can cancel.
So the interesting thing is that there are built-in contingencies for the buyer in a transaction, typically, but there is hardly any contingencies for the seller to back out of the transaction. So if something happens, for instance, maybe one of the spouses pass away, something horrible happens, the seller decides to cancel the transaction, and the buyer says, no, I want your house, I've made moving plans, I want you to close the transaction, what are the options from there? So the seller then can request a cancellation from the buyer, and if the buyer says yes, okay, they've succeeded. If the buyer says, no, I'm not canceling the transaction, I want to buy the house, then what are the options?
It's attorney time.
Yeah.
And the seller's gonna lose.
Yeah.
So the buyer would probably hire an attorney, and the attorney would probably sue the seller for specific performance, for them to perform per the agreement. That's what we think would happen, but we're not attorneys. So,
Talk to your attorney.
Talk to your attorney. Any other input, you guys?
I think that probably settles it.
All right. So there's one of the issues that we've run across recently, and thought we'd share.